So as I said, we're not going to actually go through all of modules 6 and 7. There's a lot more data, a lot more information obviously in the toolkit than we're providing you today, but 6 and 7 in particular is really technical. Module 7 is actually about how you modify in-plan based on what we know about local and regional food systems, how you integrate some of that primary data that you might collect. So we aren't going to go into that today, but if you're ever working with somebody who has some of that expertise, who wants some advanced understanding, if you're putting together some kind of RFP, you're putting together a call for a consultant, I recommend that you actually go and look at what we have in modules 6 and 7, and you can put it together that way. Hopefully that will save you a little bit of time and money because you have some idea of exactly what you're looking for. So there are two things that we think really make up a good study. One is using good data, and the second is making sound assumptions. And right, this all has to do with the fact that we know that local and regional food systems are this entrepreneurial, innovative, constantly changing space. And we want to make sure that a study reflects that. It reflects that dynamism, that there are differences in local and regional food system activity that might exist in that ag data, for example, in in-plan. So we can and should, in this case, adapt our input-output models, right? Because there's evidence that farmers and value-added businesses interact differently than with the local economy than more commodity-oriented or traditional farms. So we want to make sure we're reflecting this. And if you think about it, by definition, a food hub is going to purchase more from local sources than would a traditional distributor, right? Because the definition of a food hub is that they're purchasing from local food sources, right? That they're doing this import substitution that we talked about earlier. Does that make sense to everybody? So we want to make sure we're accounting for those differences because that is where we're likely to see more of the economic impact occurring. So let's just talk about this intuitively for a second. So here are two tomato farms, or two farms that are growing tomatoes. This has nothing to do with a value judgment. These are just two different kinds of operations, right? We see on the left here a larger scale commodity-oriented operation, right? This tomato farm is producing a lot of tomatoes. What do we notice about that picture? Mechanized, right? On the right, we have a farm that is, operating on a different scale. What are they doing there? Hand harvesting, right? So what each of these farms require in terms of inputs is going to be very different. And we're not even talking about total inputs. We're just talking about for every dollar that they spend to make that farm operate, what do they need to purchase? Those purchases are going to look different, right? Especially if you think about it, the farm on the right, if they're selling through local markets, so say that they're selling at farmers markets, we know that selling at a farmer's market takes a lot of time, right? You're sitting there for 7 hours. If it's raining, you may not sell a lot of stuff. You have to use different kinds of packaging to sell for farmers markets, right? That packaging's expensive sometimes. You're probably doing a lot of hand packaging. You have additional fuel costs, right? You may be less efficient in your fuel utilization because maybe you don't have a full truckload going to market, but you're traveling longer distances. Maybe you're going to several markets. So local food system producers, farms that are selling through these local markets, have different expenditure patterns. They need different inputs per dollar of expenditure than do other kinds of producers. And even if we didn't have a scale difference, this is probably true. Because if we had, say we had two large-scale tomato farms, right? If one of them is selling all of their tomatoes into a large-scale processor, a more commodity-oriented processor, they can get a tractor-trailer load of tomatoes together, or whatever it's going to be, and they can ship it over there. That tomato grower that's growing for these more locally oriented markets is going to probably have additional marketing, packaging costs associated with it. Does that make sense to everybody? So thinking about these differences is key to understanding the economic impacts. And this is just from a study that I did with some colleagues in New York State to actually prove that this is true. So the number, I don't want you to actually look through all of these things, but to say that on the left is the data that we collected. And we collected information from over 100 small and mid-scale farms that were selling through direct markets. The right 4 columns are all data using, it's the ARMS data, Agricultural Resource Management Survey. So you know how Becky mentioned in Module 3 we have this list, Module 2 we have this list of data sources, and one of them we said, well, I can't remember what we called it, but like restricted access or a little bit more technical. So you have to, this is restricted access data, but many universities have access to it. It's through the USDA, but it's the best source of financial information that we have for farms across the country. And in 2008, they started asking questions about whether or not farms sold through local markets. So you can see on the right are farms in New York State that sell through local markets, and in the middle, and then on the right are farms that don't sell through local markets, and we split them up by commodity. What's important to see here is that as a percentage of expenditure, farms that are selling through local markets are spending much more on labor than other farms, are spending significantly more on labor, right? And this is some work that we've been doing at Colorado State using that ARMS data, again, looking nationally at this. So at the top, we have all of the farms in the country that are not selling through local food, markets. And on the bottom, we have all the farms in the country that are selling through local food markets. And this is their expenditures. And I'll make sure that these slides are available. But again, what I want to highlight here is look at the difference in percentage of total expenditure on labor. Now think about the multiplier. Why might this be important? What is the multiplier again? Direct plus indirect plus, and remember, what is induced? How households, right? And those households are the people who are paid wages, right? So this is, and wages usually, but not always, usually labor is local, right? Not always, but usually labor is local. So this can be a place where we have a lot of local economic impact, because if we are spending more on wages and those employees are going out and spending some of that money locally, that can make a difference. Yes, Dave?
Do you differentiate this between, say, owner-supplied labor and hired labor?
This is only hired labor. We're not including the owner piece in here.
Which could be an infinite amount.
Right. It could, right. Which brings, and we're going to spend some time talking about that this afternoon too. But yeah, this is just employee compensation essentially. Okay, so we talked about in-plan data a little bit, comes primarily from national sources. So each in-plan sector is represented by a single fixed expenditure pattern. So basically it's that in-plan sector, we know what that sector needs to purchase in order to produce its output, right, based on percentages. So in agriculture, depending on how you define agriculture, we have 14 or 19 sectors. So I'll give you an example. A sector might be fruit farming. So that is the most disaggregated information you can get. So you're not going to be able to figure out how apple growers differ from peach growers. Does that make sense to everybody? So what we have within the in-plan data is that fruit producers in your region, on average, spend this percentage on each of these sectors. So they spend 13% of their expenditure on labor, they spend 5% on utilities, et cetera, et cetera. Does that make sense to everybody? And that's the information that's used then to calculate the multiplier impact. But if you think about it, because of all the things we just talked about, that is likely not reflective of the local food producers in your region. Another reason we didn't mention why it's not reflective, most likely, is that it's very unlikely in your region that that data is dominated by farms that are selling through local markets, right? Because we still know that that's a small share of total farms, right? Does that make sense to everybody? So that's why, in a good study, we may need to do some modifications on that sector to actually understand how this local food farm sector behaves, what their linkages are with other industries. Right? Does that make sense to everybody? Yeah? Okay. Right? Because if we did a shock and we said that let's say we had some kind of shock that came in, and we said that there's going to be an additional $1 million of sales in the fruit farming sector. Well, if we actually run that through our model, and we can try that later this afternoon, you're going to get a different result likely than if you actually reflected how those locally oriented fruit farmers behave, right? Starting point, they're not going to give you the local versus non-local expenditure. Yes, but not every state is doing them for locally oriented producers. So the key piece here is that the enterprise budgets, if everyone's familiar with that terminology, they're not the same for farms that are selling through local markets as farms that aren't selling through local markets. For a long time in this country, we have collected data nationally based on commodity and not based on market channel. And we know that the market channel you're utilizing is going to affect what you need to purchase, right? Because labor is going to be a big factor in farmers market sales, as an example. So we need to think, if you are lucky enough to have a university, and I don't know if North Carolina is doing any of these. Have you seen them here?
There are some, not necessarily by market channel, but there are some organic production budgets.
That could work?
Like Carolina Farm Stewardship Association is
Okay.
developed with others. But there's interest in that, but I don't think that our institutions have really fully embraced that idea yet.
And there are some that are starting. We are working at Colorado State to try to generate more of these, at least regionally, if not by the state. I know Rebecca Dunning spoke yesterday about these market channel assessments. That would probably help to get at some of those if you end up starting to do some of those here. So yes, these are great places to start. And again, the more that you can sort of avoid some of the primary data collection, that you have some of this data from which to start, the better off you are. Okay. So this is an important piece, so I want to make sure everybody's clear about it. Dave, if you have anything to add to make it more clear, let me know. Yeah.
I'm just trying to get an idea of cost for these, and getting in-plan is a cost, and conducting the survey. So if a community, Rocky Mountain area, two counties wanted to go together and get this kind of data developed for the local food system, what kind of ballpark cost are we talking to get good data?
So the question was about, what is sort of a ballpark cost to get good data? So the first piece of that is that through this local food survey, you could at least get some numbers. I believe we'll be able to get some numbers on some of the biggest expenditures. Like I will say now that I've done a number of these studies, and at first we went out and tried to collect information on every single expenditure item. You don't need to go and collect information on every single expenditure item, right? We know that there's a few biggies in there that are places, labor and fuel are going to be the big differences in general in this kind of system, right? That makes sense. And then maybe the local versus non-local. This is really hard data to get. I've spent an hour, where you're spending 2 hours at a farmer's kitchen table trying to figure this out. So it's hard. And then we know a lot of, especially the small or mid-scale producers we work with, don't necessarily keep great records, right? Which makes it even more complicated. If you're not trying to publish this in an academic journal and you really just want your community to have some good data from which to work, going and talking to a few representative producers, so producers that you think are somewhat reflective of expenditures, of people's purchases, of farms' purchases in your local region, and having a conversation with them, you can use that information then to make some changes with an in-plan. I mean, it's not, again, you're not going to get it published in an academic journal, but that's not your goal. If your goal is to really try to understand some of these differences. And the reality is, we're telling you how to do these economic impact assessments because I think that having this multiplier information is good. But this isn't the information that your communities should actually use to make their planning decisions, right? This helps to sort of sell your project. It helps to tell about the economic value of your project, but your community is going to want to make decisions on lots of other reasons, right? What you really want to understand if you're going to go collect this information from producers is what are the farm profitability impacts of selling through these kinds of markets? Are our producers actually benefiting, right? So expenditures are a piece of that, but it's only one piece. So I'm not answering your question directly. I think what we're trying to do now, we've gotten some money to do these market channel assessments. And we think if we're going to actually go out into a community and work with producers, that's way more valuable because they really get something from it. They can really understand how to make better decisions about what markets they should be using, about return on per labor hour, right? We know at least labor is a big factor, right? Access to labor is huge right now. So that's how we're going to spend our resources. And I'll tell you, for these market channel assessments, they take about a week to do. You don't have to be on the farm the whole time, but it takes about a week of data collection. We pay farmers an incentive to participate. So we pay them, $100 to participate in these things. They're collecting data for a week in the middle of the height of the growing season, and we try to make, a visit or two to that farm. So it's a substantial endeavor.
And is the survey that you're using in here, or is that available?
We don't, and I will say that the instruments that we're using are continually evolving. So if you email me, and I've got cards, I can send you copies of latest versions because, just like everybody else, I've made lots of mistakes. Is that? Okay. So again, an enterprise budget, you want to know not just what producers are purchasing and where they're selling products, but you also need to know where. So it's really intensive, and it's a very data-intensive process. Okay, so moving on from good data, let's talk about sound assumptions for a minute. We have finite resources, right? It's not just us individually have finite resources, the government has finite resources. So every decision involves a choice. So going back to that very astute comment over here, what we want to think about when we do these economic impact assessments is not coming up with some gross impact number, but we want to actually net it out. We want to understand if you have households that are now purchasing product at a farmer's market, it's unlikely that they're now growing their household food budget. They're probably making less purchases from somewhere. Now, historically, people have said that those net purchases may come from grocery stores. I haven't done a study to verify this, but I would guess that those households actually are probably now doing more cooking at home. So it may not impact their grocery store purchases. They may be more likely to go to a grocery store to get the rest of the basket of goods they need, and they may be less likely to eat out. But so you want to think through that before you make the assumption about where those changes or how this impacts consumer behavior. It's also important to remember that these changes can happen on both the supply side as well as the demand side. So I'll give you an example. Here we're going to actually go through a few examples. So we talked about some of these assumptions that go into these models. So we have the no resource constraint assumption on the supply side, right? But this probably doesn't make sense. So if you think about it, if we have good arable land, it's unlikely that if you have another farm that they're going to start producing on land that's fallow. Now, maybe that's true in some urban places if you're talking about urban agriculture, that maybe we talk about Detroit, and we've had a lot of vacant lots in Detroit as an example. So maybe in some places this isn't exactly true, but in a place like Iowa, where Dave's from, right, there's no way that you have good productive soil that's not planted right now, that's not currently in production. So if you increase your vegetable production, you're probably going to decrease your corn production. Does that make sense to everybody? And you want to think about that, especially if you're talking about something that happens at any sort of scale. And then that no opportunity cost of spending assumption on the demand side, that goes back to what I was talking about, that if you increase farmers market sales, you may be decreasing sales somewhere else. And just to keep in mind, because I go in, when I talk to community groups, they think that like grocery stores, you got to remember grocery stores have local economic impacts. Walmart has local economic impact. So here's an example of a study that Dave did. Dave, do you want to say something quick about this study? No, you want me to? Okay, I'll just go and butcher his study. So I'm just going to go to the map right here. So basically, Dave did a study of the whole Midwest. And he said that, so we have these major urban centers in the Midwest. I can't remember how many they have, but they have these major urban centers. So say we wanted to have people eat local vegetables. We want to satisfy the demand for local fruits and vegetables based on production in this region. What would that actually mean? How much acreage would we have to divert away from corn production to satisfy that demand? What I think is really interesting about this study is that what he shows is that you can produce a whole lot more fruits and vegetables on that productive land than you can corn. So it's not a one-for-one substitution, right? So what he's showing here are the expected acres that would be required. So you can see the darker it is, the more acres that you would need. So when he actually calculates what the economic impact would be of growing these fruits and vegetables for this region, what he says is there's still positive economic impact, and I didn't include the numbers here, but there's still positive impact, but it's less than it would be when you actually net out the decrease in the value of that corn and soy production. Does that make sense to everybody? So you're taking some acres away from corn and soy and putting them into fruit and vegetables, but you're not taking out probably as many as some might think off the bat, even though we know that there's not additional acres just kind of laying around to grow fruits and vegetables, because fruits and vegetables, they're so much more productive on that land, right? You can have much more output of fruits and vegetables than you can have corn and soy. Does that make sense? But the important part is that he actually did that. He actually netted it out. He understood what the change in production was going to mean for the region in terms of that land.
Do you even figure out the different labor costs, the different machinery required for that whole transition?
So it would be included in the model, because what he's using the same modeling technique we're talking about. We can do some of this work this afternoon, but that's exactly what he's doing. He's saying, we know that corn and soy producers, they need these kinds of inputs, and they know that these are the linkages that they have with industries. If we take out all of those interlinked industry expenditures and we add these fruit and vegetable expenditures, what is the net? And it does have a net gain in the community, in the region. Did I butcher that too badly?
Right.
Okay.
You did fine.
Okay.
Just 1/3.
Yeah.
Basically, you lost about 1/3 of your transforming. The offset was about 1/3.
Okay.
So 2/3 gain.
2/3 gain. Oh, yeah.
So I don't really know what I'm talking about here, but hopefully the room will kind of follow. There's so much tobacco land
Yeah.
in North Carolina, and there seems to be this, so the fruit and vegetable production, there's this sort of drive to, let's convert from tobacco to fruit and vegetable production, and then there's always the surge for, some other miracle crop. So has this been done in North Carolina, to your knowledge, to see what the value, the impact of the fruit and vegetable production is on that same 100 acres of land that used to be tobacco? Has anything like that been done?
I'm just going to repeat the question. So the question is, in North Carolina, where we have incentive to basically take land out of tobacco and substitute it with fruit and vegetables or some other crops, has there been this similar kind of economic impact assessment done to look at what the potential is for that? I'm not aware of any. Is anyone else? But keep in mind that this is only, if someone does want to replicate this, and we'd be happy to talk through some of these steps, that what this study doesn't do is it doesn't talk about whether or not there is interest from households in actually purchasing those additional products, right? It doesn't look at any of that, right? It just says I think was it based on dietary requirements?
No.
It was based on current?
No, we took the consumer as they were, so we calculated
Right.
what we thought what is average consumption, then we put together a bundle of fruits and vegetables that they could grow, and then said we're going to substitute this for what's currently being consumed.
Okay, so it was based on current consumption, not based on the dietary requirements. There's another study in Michigan that does do it based on the dietary requirements. But so you really want to think about, for a study like this, so it's not just can you grow it and what the economic impact is, because again, it's just not going to get into the feasibility of it. So this wouldn't tell you anything about, is it the same soil? I don't know anything about this kind of stuff. It wouldn't tell you anything about, do those supply chains exist to facilitate, the processing or however that product would need to be purchased. It doesn't tell you anything about how do consumers actually want to get that product? Would they purchase that product? Can you grow the right things seasonally? All of those kinds of questions. I'm just saying this to say these are the other pieces we don't bring into the toolkit and tell you, talk about how to do, that you would really want to bring into a robust study. Did you want to add to that, Dave?
To Becky's question, my understanding in North Carolina, you've lost a lot of tobacco land already, right? And there's some of this kind of new wave tobacco that's being produced for this pretty small market, I think, still. So it's a little bit different scenario, I think. And then, the idea of this opportunity cost concept is that it's the next best alternative use of those factors of production, primarily land in this case you're concerned with. So what is it, looking forward 5 years, what is the next best alternative use of that land? So it's laying fallow probably almost, right? So it's not really, you're not really backing out anything that has to do with the value of the tobacco production at this point in time. That's not the choice set that's facing the owners of land or producers. So it's really the opportunity cost of that land is lying fallow or whatever it's doing right now, growing houses perhaps. That might be the next best use versus the vegetable fruit production that you're thinking about. Am I wrong on that?
No, you're right. You're right.
So I'm just thinking out loud too.
I mean,
Right.
well, growing houses, that works in urban areas, but
Right.
the rural areas where you have those fallow lands.
Right.
Yeah.
And this is a perfect conversation for this. I mean, this is talking about sound assumptions. So this is why you need your community to have this process, to have people who are representing these diverse opinions, that Becky talked about it this morning, so that you can really understand what are the sound assumptions that make sense in this region. How is this land being used? Yeah, please.
I've done a lot of studies on alternative energy production, for example, grasses, seasonal grasses, soft willow and everything like that. And it's the same type of thing. I have land out there that's certainly being used, and then the whole idea of the scenario of we converting to warm or cool season grasses and we're going to use it for cellulosic ethanol production. We have to calculate out what we weren't doing with that land. Now sometimes that land is lying fallow or the land is pasture. Nonetheless, I have to figure out what was the worth of that land to the economy. So it's not necessarily comparing locally grown foods like fruits and vegetables to grains or tobacco. That may not be the offset. It might be my trade-off between fruits and vegetables and CRP land. It still has to have a value that I have to offset, and it does bring either some resources to the farmer or it has some sort of multiplier effect in the regional economy, given the existing uses.
Yeah, great.
I think there's a lot of recognized values too to, fallow land, for example, or pollinator habitat, these ecosystem services, and, we don't want to forget that because, fallow land is very valuable
Right.
for rotation.
Well, we don't stick those in the market.
Right.
Now we're talking social and environmental benefits, and that's a benefit cost analysis.
That's exactly, that the ecosystem services aren't included. I will say, though, that we have a big research project that I'm part of it's out of Cornell University right now. And what we're trying to do actually is put in some of these non-market valued goods, essentially, into this kind of framework so that we can understand then what the implications are in terms of like rural development or rural wealth creation. So, yes, but this framework doesn't account for that inherently. Okay. A study that I worked on when I was at Cornell with some folks, we looked at the economic impact of a food hub. And the piece here that I just want to bring your attention to is that we surveyed over 300 of the customers of a food hub, which we selected as sort of a representative food hub in New York State. And what we found is that these customers, half of them reported that they purchased less from other sources because of the food hub. So even though the food hub is not in this case, but you may be building a new food hub and trying to look at the economic impact of it, you want to think about how those customers are changing their purchasing behavior because of that food hub. So they may, in the end, they may be purchasing less from other local businesses, and you want to make sure you net out that the lost economic activity from those sectors. Sound assumptions, another thing you should be considering. So this is a map that was put together by Luann Lohr and Adam Diamond that looked at competition for vendors at farmers markets. So if you put in a food hub, right, most food hubs, the goal of the food hub is to enhance farm viability, right, create new opportunities for farms to scale up or to be viable and sell their product. Well, in some places, if you're trying to put in a new farmer's market, there's already lots of competition for vendors. So instead of just growing additional product to sell at more farmers markets, you may now have vendors that are pulling out of one market and starting to sell at another. So the impact of that market then is going to be very different. So thinking about then how those suppliers are going to react based on the availability of this new market is really important. You know, keeping in mind those seasonal constraints and all of those kinds of things is really important. So anyway, I just want to, because we're almost out of time here. We understand that, especially if you're funded by a county and you're really passionate about this kind of food system initiative, that getting the largest multiplier, there's an incentive to get the largest multiplier possible. But we really want to caution you against doing that because we want these food system impact assessments. You know, we want to have these more standardized methods that people are doing that, and we really want to show what we think is a more accurate representation of how these food system initiatives are impacting local economies. So we would encourage you to, you know, if you're going to do one of these studies, to, even though there is that incentive to sort of overestimate or inflate the numbers, to be more rigorous about what your assumptions are and the data that you're using, so that we can do a really good job as a community who's working in food systems, you know, nationally and you know, doing this kind of work. So I'm going to move on to talking about what we know about the economic impacts of food systems, and I know that there may be more questions, but we're going to be, you know, actually going through how to do it after lunch, so hopefully that we'll have a lot of additional time to talk about some of those questions. Is that okay with everybody? Continue to become more clear. Okay, we're going to just do this quickly. So I was part of a recent report to Congress called Trends in U.S. Local and Regional Food Systems, and so I'm a little biased, but I think this report does a really good job talking about sort of what do we actually know. You know, what are not, especially getting something like this through the USDA, and trust me, it was an arduous process. They really only let us include stuff in here that we had data to back up. So what do we actually know? A lot of this is going to be based on this report, but if you haven't looked at it, I encourage you to do so. The first I've mentioned already. We know that local food farms that are selling through local food markets, regardless of scale, have different expenditures. They need different inputs to purchase their outputs. What is really interesting, and we haven't gone to publish this yet, but what we're now seeing at Colorado State with some of the research we're doing, is that even as farms get larger, these local food farms get larger, like over $1 million in sales, they're significantly more likely to use more labor as a percentage of expenditure, which has, as someone who actually thinks about farm profitability impacts, some really interesting implications potentially for thinking about efficiency, right? Because normally in agriculture, we think about being more efficient as using less labor. But anyway, we'll leave that for another day. We also have preliminary evidence from a number of case studies, this is from some work I did, that farms that are selling through these local markets spend more money locally as a percentage of total expenditure than do more commodity-oriented farms. Now this may have scale impacts, and this may be a result of scale, and we haven't really been able to get the data to net this out, but they are spending more money locally from the case studies that we can see. So there are now a handful of these studies, more than a handful, that have actually gone and account for those differential expenditure patterns when they've done these input-output models and these assessments. And so we can see that they do have small positive local economic impacts in general, but what we see is that these impacts are small. So they're not big. And I think a big part of it is, and we'll talk about this in a second, that we're not accounting for all of these other benefits that actually may have economic impacts, but that aren't incorporating these kinds of models. So in general, the multipliers range from about 1.4 to 1.82. This is in general the multiplier range we're seeing. And there are some studies that are looking at the economic impacts of farmers markets, a few that are doing farm-to-school programs, food hubs. Dave actually has a great study looking at small-scale meat processing facilities and their economic impact. We try to provide some case studies and places you can turn in that toolkit as well, so studies that we actually think are doing a good job with these economic impact assessments. So you can see here the trends. We have these multiplier impacts, they're less than 2, and we can see, yes, they're positive impacts, but they're kind of small. Especially for people who work in this area, they're probably not like the overwhelming economic impact stories that you might want to be telling. But we have a lot of challenges with this research and good reasons why we haven't been able to do more of this, and more of it hasn't been done. Limited data availability. Many of these studies are case study specific, especially if they're going out and collecting information from farms. We're not looking at long-term impacts, and again, this is where I think we're going to see more of the impacts occurring. You know, the impacts in social capital, opportunities for entrepreneurship, right? How many of these more innovative entrepreneurial businesses have started? What about rural communities that have vibrant local food systems that now become places where people want to stay, right? We know in rural places across the country, we've had declines in population for the first time in the history of the United States since 2010. You know, maybe because we have sort of a threshold level, or we get beyond a threshold level of food system activity, now we have places that younger people in the next generation they like to live, right? Those are the kinds of things we aren't getting at in this kind of framework right now. These studies really aren't getting at the distribution of impacts. In-plan does divide, it does divide households into 9 of these household income groups. However, you know, I talked about how we actually want to do some modifications of in-plan. Getting information about who is purchasing local food by household income group is almost impossible, right? So we could get it maybe for SNAP versus non-SNAP, right? Because we have some information if people are participating in double up buck programs or things like that, but it's really difficult. So we really haven't had good studies that have looked at which household income groups are impacted and how are they impacted through local and regional food systems. We also know now from national data that local and regional food system activity is concentrated in urban areas, right? And there's tons of evidence to show this. So we know this is the value of farm direct sales to consumers was greatest in highly urban areas. This is a little bit old, but here's one about farmers markets concentrated in metro counties. But the question is, how do local and regional food systems actually impact rural communities and economies? And I would argue actually that the U.S. Department of Agriculture, one of the main reasons that they're funding these kinds of initiatives is to support rural economic development. So does the money from these urban-based sales go back to rural communities? What does that look like? How are farm profits impacted if they have to travel longer distance to get to these markets? You know, is there a scale that they have to be at to make that work so that they can have a full truckload? And there's a ton of questions here about the economic impact that really haven't been answered. Where do these supply chain businesses develop? Are they only going to work if they're in urban places, or can they be located in rural places? Can we do the processing in rural places and then bring it to urban places? So there's a lot of these questions here about impact. The other question here that we haven't answered is about trade-offs, right? So if we have some evidence that these farmers that are selling through local and regional food markets are spending more money locally, maybe it's more expensive, and that impedes profitability. Does that make sense? So maybe it's cheaper to buy your inputs from some distant source than it is to buy it from the local community. So this is another reason why we don't necessarily want to maximize our multiplier, because we may have these trade-offs here we want to consider, right? Our multiplier is going to be higher if everybody purchases 100% of their stuff locally, but that may not be feasible. Or that may have a difficult effect or may negatively impact low-income community groups, right, when we talk about food prices and those kinds of things. So there is some evidence that businesses near farmers markets reported higher sales on market days. There have not been more recent studies that I'm aware of that have really done a lot of work in this area that have been published in the peer-reviewed literature. But if this is true, this is another interesting question then about urban versus rural, right? We know rural farmers markets struggle more than urban farmers markets do. So if we have more people who are going and shopping at these urban places, do urban places actually get more of the benefit from it? And then there's also some evidence, but again, we haven't had enough recent studies that have looked at how farmers market increase property values in the market district. So evaluating these longer-term impacts, I think, are potentially more important because I think that this is probably where many of these more important impacts lie, but they're very, very difficult to get, right? You can't just start with the in-plan data. Farmers markets, there's lots of evidence in the literature, and in fact, Dara's chair of her dissertation committee has written some about this, talking about how farmers markets serve as business incubators. Right? So if you're a community that's trying to evaluate the impact of your farmers markets, you may not just want to think about what is the economic impact, because that short-term economic impact may be short-sighted. Maybe your farmers market is helping to develop a business that's going to have important impacts 5-10 years down the road, right? So thinking about how this economic impact may only be a piece of the story that you tell. The regular interactions between people at farmers markets can generate and circulate knowledge to develop new kinds of products, right? So it may be products that aren't necessarily sold at a farmers market. So I'm doing this study right now, the green markets in New York City. It's the largest farmers market network in the country. And we can see from interviewing farmers that these farmers are getting lots of new ideas to develop new kinds of products through consumer interactions at those markets. They may not sell those products at the markets, they may sell them through other outlets, but that interaction seems to be important in thinking more about the long-term impacts. So thinking just about that the direct sales income may be less important than some of the skills that are developed and some of the long-term relationships, and especially business relationships that could happen through those markets. I was just talking about this. That report to Congress shows that if we look at farm business survivability, the farm business survivability definition has nothing to do with profitability. All it says is that the farm existed in the 2007 census and it still exists in the 2012 census. And what we can see here is that farms across every sales category were more likely, statistically, or significantly more likely, right? And this is, I'm using significant in the statistically significant sense, right? That they were more likely to survive, to be in business in both 2007 and 2012. So not a scale issue. You can see that on the left is no direct sales and on the right is direct sales. So that's a positive sign, but this is again just business survivability, because we have mixed results if we actually now look at, this is percent change in sales. So it doesn't say profitability, this is just in terms of sales, total sales. And we can see that there are significantly different relationships between those farms that don't have direct sales and those that do. However, across some of the sales categories, the direct sales farms had lower percent change in sales. Does that make sense to everybody? So it's all available in the report. The takeaway here is just that there's mixed messages in what the farm profitability impacts are in terms of the local food markets. This is some research that has been led up by Steve Vogel at the USDA Economic Research Service, but in a paper that we are hopefully about to publish. And what we can see here is that for small-scale operations, which are defined by the USDA Economic Research Service as under 350,000 in sales, the red are farms that are participating in local markets, blue is farms that aren't. What we can see is that their break-even point is that they're more quickly to hit their break-even point for those small-scale operations if they're participating in those local markets. So they have a lower operating expense ratio on average. Right, so they need less sales to hit that break-even point. And then on the other side, what we can see on the right is that farmers are more likely at that small scale to earn positive profits. But again, that trend reverses after they're over 350,000 in sales. So there seems to be some kind of benefit for smaller scale producers based on this data to participate in local markets. But that trend reverses again after 350,000. Yeah?
Does he know whether farm labor for production on small farms includes farm labor?
So no. So this would be, so in this one, and I don't want to misspeak here, but I'm pretty sure that the way that this is calculated is not, it would not be including, including the proprietor income, which is what you're talking about. So proprietor income, so basically there's an expense of what's paid to your labor, to your employees, right? But if a farm is an owner and they're getting returns, that would be after you net out what the expenses are.
No, there's sometimes farms where pay themselves labor
Right.
versus taking profit. So
It depends on how the business is structured. So this would include so the operating expenses would include any payments to labor, but not to the operator.
even as
Separate.
management costs and profit.
So so it depends on how the farm is structured, but as I understand it, in this situation, it would be if the owner is paying him or herself as an employee, that's one thing, or as a manager, then it would be included in what their operating expenses are. If they're not, and if they're basically taking a cut of the profits, then that wouldn't be included in here. Does that make sense? Okay, we're getting to the very end here because I know I'm eating into lunch here. So this is from the study, the Food Hub study. We asked the farms that were selling through the Food Hubs what percentage of their total sales were facilitated by the Food Hub. And what we found in each of these bars represents an individual producer. The blue are sales that were facilitated by regional access, which is the food hub we looked at. The green green is facilitated by regional access, the food hub. Blue is not facilitated by regional access. What we found that I think is interesting is that for mid-scale producers, so those in the roughly, let's just say like 150,000 to 750,000 range, they were more likely to have their sales facilitated by regional access than at either end of the extreme. So this is some of the only evidence I've seen that food hubs are actually helping these mid-scale producers to get more product to market. We need a lot more evidence. This is from one case study, but I think it's some preliminary evidence that they are helping mid-scale producers, which makes sense if you think about it, because the large farms have other options. The small guys can sell at these direct-to-consumer outlets, but it's these mid-scale folks that are needing additional support. And just to end up here, what I just wanted to say is in terms of the toolkit, we have gotten another round of funding from the USDA Ag Marketing Service. That's how we're here today, actually, is this round of funding to provide technical assistance to communities. So we really want to help communities that are interested in doing some of these case studies to understand how you might use the toolkit, what additional resources you might need, if this is actually helping you in your planning process or your evaluation process. So we want to continue to do more of these. We actually, through our website, localfoodeconomics.com, have a place where you can go and request a training. We're not going to come back to North Carolina, but if you have if you're working with other people across the country who are interested. And then we want to update and continue to augment, especially our website, with more case studies. Just had a conversation about that. If you have a good example of a case study, if you think you've done some piece of the toolkit well in your community, there's a place where we can upload that information. And we've really been getting a lot of traction on that website. We're also going to be doing another sort of larger scale training with some folks through e-extension. That's going to happen at the Food Distribution Research Conference in New Orleans, which is at end of September, early October, and you can go to our website to find more information. It will include an advanced training, so if you are really digging the numbers you're crunching with Dave today and you want to actually get into implant and do some dirty work, then this would be a good place to do it. And we're trying to figure out if we can get some scholarships to bring people, especially from underserved communities. So here's our website, and there's a lot more information and resources. We have a listserv there as well, you can find the data sources there. And more resources from Ag Marketing Service. We don't want to forget about all of those other. They've been providing support for a number of different interesting toolkits. With that, I'm going to let you all actually eat. And the one thing is, over lunch, if you brought a computer, we're going to have Dave's personal website up here. There's a link on there where you can actually download Dave's pretty good Excel spreadsheet. That's what he calls it, not me. So it's a pretty good Excel spreadsheet. So if you want to go sometime over lunch and download that, that would be great because, especially if we can get sort of 2 people to a computer, everyone has a computer, that's ideal, but 2 people to a computer at least, so that you can actually work while he's